Georgia, 1974. The sun was slipping behind the long tree line, casting gold across miles of farmland. It should have been an ordinary summer evening. Children called in for supper, fireflies drifting over the grass. But on this day, something unthinkable happened. Two young brothers, Evan Harper, age 9, and his little brother Jake, just 7, vanished from their family's farm without a sound, without a struggle, and without a single trace. One moment, they were seen heading toward the old barn on the west side of the property. The next, they were simply gone. As night settled over rural Georgia, their mother stood on the porch, hands trembling, calling their names into the humid darkness. "Evan! Jake!" Her voice echoed across the fields and into the nearby woods. No answer. Deputies arrived, flashlights cutting through the dark, boots sinking into the soft soil. Neighbors formed lines and swept through every acre. Dogs were brought in. Lanterns glowed deep between the trees. But the Harper brothers were nowhere. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not a broken twig to suggest which direction they went. 50 years later, the mystery remains unsolved. How could two children vanish from a wide-open farm in broad daylight? What happened in those missing minutes between the boys leaving the yard and their mother calling them home? And why, after half a century, has no evidence of their fate ever surfaced? Tonight, we begin our deep dive into one of Georgia's most haunting cold cases. Hello, and welcome to Vanishing Case Archive, where we explore history's most perplexing disappearances and the cold cases that still demand answers. If you appreciate long-form investigations and detailed storytelling, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more cases just like this. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The Harper family lived on a modest farm outside the quiet town of Red Oak, Georgia, surrounded by rolling fields, thick woods, and gravel roads that seemed to stretch endlessly. The farm sat at the end of a long, dusty driveway, marked by a rusted mailbox and a towering oak tree whose branches cast shadows across the path. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. A place where neighbors waved from passing trucks, where Sundays meant church gatherings, and where children roamed freely without fear. Evan and Jake Harper fit perfectly into that world. Evan, 9 years old, was adventurous and bold. He talked about becoming a farmer like his father, Samuel Harper. He loved exploring the property, checking on the animals, climbing hay bales, collecting stones from the creek. Jake, 7, was quieter. He adored animals, especially the old barn cat that slept wherever the sunlight hit. He followed Evan everywhere. If Evan wandered toward the woods, Jake hurried after him. If Evan discovered a new hiding spot, Jake made sure he learned it too. They were inseparable. It was midsummer, hot, humid, and still. The kind of day when the air hung heavy over the fields. Ruth Harper, their mother, spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner, while Samuel worked on repairing a fence along the north pasture. The boys were supposed to stay close to the house, but sometime late in the afternoon, Evan asked if they could check on the animals in the barn. Ruth agreed, reminding them to be back before dinner. It was the last time she would ever see them. The moment Ruth realized the boys were late, she stepped out onto the porch and called their names, expecting to see two small figures running back across the yard. But the fields remained still. The barn door stood slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. There was no movement inside. She called again, louder this time, Still nothing. Ruth walked toward the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting to find them distracted by a stray kitten or climbing the hay bales like they often did. But as she stepped inside, the barn was empty. The tools were untouched, the feed bins closed, and the air felt strangely quiet. A knot tightened in her stomach. She searched behind the barn, checked the chicken coop, scanned the fence line where the boys sometimes chased each other. No sign of them, no laughter, no arguing, no rustling in the grass. By the time Samuel returned from the north pasture, Ruth was frantic. Together, they swept the property, the shed, the far field, the creek bed where Evan liked to skip stones. They shouted the boys' names until their voices began to crack. As the sun fell behind the trees, fear settled in. This wasn't playful hiding. This wasn't mischief. Something was wrong. Just after nightfall, Samuel drove into town to alert the sheriff's office. Within 30 minutes, a deputy's patrol car crawled down the driveway, headlights scanning the yard. Soon after, neighbors began arriving, some still in work boots, others carrying lanterns or flashlights, ready to help. They formed lines across the fields, walking shoulder to shoulder, sweeping their lights through waist-high grass. Calls for Evan and Jake echoed into the woods. Dogs barked from distant houses. Crickets fell silent as dozens of footsteps moved through the farmland. Deputies searched the tree line with trained dogs, but the dogs seemed confused, circling, sniffing, then wandering aimlessly as if the boys had never passed through. Some volunteers checked the creek, worried the boys might have slipped or fallen. Others climbed into pickup trucks and drove slowly along the surrounding dirt roads, scanning ditches and fence lines. As the night deepened, the Harpers' farmhouse glowed like a lighthouse in the distance. Ruth stayed on the porch, clutching one of Jake's sweaters, whispering prayers into her hands. Every set of approaching footsteps made her look up in desperate hope. But each time, the answer was the same. Nothing, no tracks, no clothing, no voices, no movement. It was as if the boys had been erased from the very ground they stood on. By dawn, the sheriff expanded the search perimeter. More volunteers arrived. A local church opened its doors to coordinate food and water for the searchers. Farmers from miles away brought horses to cover the thick brush deeper in the woods. The entire county seemed to mobilize around the Harper family. Yet hour after hour, the fields remained empty. It didn't make sense. Two young boys couldn't simply vanish from an open farm in broad daylight. There should have been footprints leading somewhere, toward the woods, toward the old dirt road, anywhere. But the ground showed nothing unusual. No signs of a struggle, no broken fences, no scattered belongings. The sheriff ordered teams to check abandoned wells, storm drains, and empty sheds across the area. Deputies visited every house within 5 miles, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. They questioned travelers who passed through town, truck drivers who stopped for fuel, hunters familiar with the nearby forest. Most people shook their heads. A few mentioned hearing dogs bark more than usual. One man claimed he heard a truck engine revving on the old logging road. Another reported seeing a figure walking along the tree line earlier that afternoon, but couldn't recall details. None of it amounted to anything solid. As the second day passed without a single clue, fear turned into something heavier: confusion, disbelief, dread. Samuel and Ruth clung to each other in their kitchen, unable to understand how their children could disappear so completely. People whispered theories: accidents, abduction, the woods, but none of them felt right. Not without evidence. Not without even one small trace to point investigators in a direction. By the end of the third day, the sheriff stepped forward to address the volunteers gathered near the farmhouse. His voice was steady, but his eyes were weary. "Until we find something," he said, "we don't know what we're dealing with." Searchers fanned out once more, lanterns swinging in the twilight. The sound of boots against dry earth filled the air. But as another night settled over the Harper farm, the fields remained silent, and the boys were still missing. The days following the disappearance grew heavier, as if the air itself refused to move. Word spread quickly through Red Oak and the surrounding communities. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the county knew the names Evan and Jake Harper. Reporters from small local papers arrived with notebooks in hand. Some stood at the end of the Harper driveway, trying to catch a glimpse of the worried parents. Others approached deputies for statements, but the sheriff kept his answers brief. "There's no evidence pointing in any direction yet," he repeated. "We're exploring every possibility." That was the truth. Every possibility was still on the table, and none of them made sense. Volunteers continued showing up, some strangers from 2 or 3 counties away. Search areas expanded into the deep woods, where the trees grew so thick that even midday felt dim. Men hacked through brush with machetes, checking ravines and hollows that children could have slipped into. Horses pushed through terrain too dense for search parties on foot. Helicopters were briefly brought in, their blades chopping through the humid summer air as they hovered over treetops. But nothing turned up. Not a shred of clothing, not a single footprint, not even a broken branch that looked out of place. As each lead collapsed, new theories emerged. Some believed the boys must have wandered into the woods and gotten lost. But if that were true, the search teams should have found at least one sign: disturbed leaves, tracks in the mud, something. And the woods, though dense, weren't endless. They bordered private hunting land, a creek system, and eventually 2 other farms. It was hard to imagine the boys slipping through all of that without being spotted. Others whispered about wildlife, bears, wild dogs, but old hunters shook their heads. Even if an animal had attacked, there would be evidence. Clothing torn, blood, tracks, something. But the fields were pristine. One deputy suggested checking every water source. Teams walked the edges of ponds, scanned creek bends, and used poles to probe the deeper water. But nothing surfaced. By the end of the first week, the sheriff admitted quietly to his deputies that they were dealing with one of the strangest disappearances he'd ever seen. Inside the Harper home, time felt frozen. Ruth barely slept. She paced from room to room, holding on to items the boys had left behind: a toy airplane of Evan's, a worn-out stuffed dog that Jake slept with. Every sound outside made her rush to the window. Samuel kept himself busy by working with search teams, refusing to stop, even when deputies urged him to rest. He walked fields over and over until his legs trembled. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, silent, as if trying to force an answer out of thin air. Neighbors brought food, casseroles, pies. Small towns tried to take care of their own. But most of those dishes went untouched. The Harpers could barely swallow a bite. As days turned to weeks, the case began shifting from an urgent search to something more grim. A mystery no one had a blueprint for. Deputies revisited every witness, rechecked the property, and reviewed every statement. They stopped cars on nearby roads, asking drivers if they'd seen anything unusual that day. A few leads trickled in. A truck driver reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup parked along the old logging road about 2 miles from the Harper farm. A neighbor thought she heard a sharp sound in the woods, a scream, or maybe just a bird. A local teen swore he saw a stranger walking near the creek that evening, but couldn't describe the person clearly. Every tip was logged. Every tip was investigated. Every tip led nowhere. The town changed after that. Children were kept closer to home. Doors that had never been locked before were bolted shut. Parents watched their kids with a new kind of fear. The kind that comes from knowing something dark might be nearby and invisible. Even the sheriff admitted privately that he felt uneasy. "It's the not knowing," he said. "That's the part that won't let you sleep." By the 3rd week, hope began to falter. Some search parties stopped coming. Reporters moved on to other stories. The sheriff's office scaled back their daily presence, though deputies still patrolled the area and checked in with the Harpers. Life around the town slowly tried to return to normal. But for the Harper family, normal was gone. Every dawn was another reminder the boys had not come home. No one had seen them. No one had heard them. And the list of unanswered questions only grew longer. Samuel and Ruth sat on the porch most evenings, eyes fixed on the same dirt road, waiting for footsteps or small silhouettes that never appeared. And as the sun set each night, the mystery of Evan and Jake's disappearance only deepened, becoming something larger and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. As summer turned into fall, the investigation shifted from frantic searching to slow, methodical questioning. The sheriff's office began reviewing every person who had been near the Harper property that week, no matter how small their involvement. They talked to farmhands, drivers, distant neighbors, even traveling salesmen who'd passed through Red Oak around the time the boys vanished. No one stood out. No one had a clear motive. No one remembered anything useful. But behind the scenes, the sheriff's team started focusing on a handful of possibilities, each unsettling in its own way. The first involved a pickup truck spotted on the old logging road the day the boys disappeared. The truck wasn't from the area. A muted blue Ford, late 60s model, with a mismatched passenger side door and a dented front bumper. A truck driver passing through town had noticed it because it was parked strangely, angled toward the woods, engine off, no driver in sight. Deputies searched the logging road, but rain had washed away any tracks. They interviewed locals who occasionally hunted in the area, but nobody recognized the truck. If the driver had anything to do with the boys' disappearance, he'd vanished just as completely. Another potential lead came from an elderly neighbor who lived across the fields, a woman known for sitting by her kitchen window with a clear view of the west pasture. She reported seeing movement along the fence line that afternoon. Shadows or figures. She wasn't sure. Her eyesight wasn't good, and she couldn't say whether it was the boys, an animal, or someone else entirely. But she insisted she saw 2 shapes, followed by a third, taller one. Deputies combed that fence line again, searching for anything they might have missed. But the ground offered no clues. Not even a bent blade of grass suggested that anyone had passed through. Rumors began swirling through Red Oak. In small towns, uncertainty bred theories. Some whispered quietly, others shared boldly in corner stores or church parking lots. Some neighbors suspected that someone in the community knew more than they were saying. A farmhand who'd quit weeks earlier. A drifter who'd been seen near the gas station and then vanished. A man who'd been drinking heavily the day the boys went missing. None of these people had direct ties to the Harpers, yet their names surfaced again and again simply because people needed someone to blame, someone to point to in the absence of evidence. The sheriff investigated each rumor, each name, each whispered accusation, but every interview ended the same way, with uncertainty. As days turned into months, the weight of the unknown began settling harshly on the Harpers. Ruth stopped going into town. The grocery store, the church, even casual conversations had become too difficult. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. Some hugged her and told her they were praying. Others simply avoided her, unsure of what words could possibly help. Samuel, by contrast, buried himself in work. He repaired fences, cleared brush, expanded the vegetable garden. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from drifting to the possibilities he refused to say out loud. Sometimes, late at night, Ruth would find him sitting alone in the barn, staring at the empty space where his boys once played. The season shifted again. Winter arrived. Frost coated the fields where volunteers had once searched, shoulder to shoulder. The barn stood quiet under a gray sky. The boys' boots remained by the back door, dust settling on them like a slow, silent snowfall. It was during that cold winter that the sheriff made a difficult announcement. After months of constant searching, interviewing, and rechecking evidence, the case was moving into what he called a long-term investigative phase. In simple terms, it meant the active search was ending. Deputies would still monitor the area. Tips would still be followed. But the daily grid searches, the community sweeps, the posted checkpoints, they were over. The resources simply weren't there to continue indefinitely. The Harpers listened to this announcement without speaking. Ruth held a handkerchief tight in her fist. Samuel stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. For them, nothing was over. Their boys were still missing. After the meeting, a small group of neighbors approached the Harpers, offering comfort. But comfort didn't mean closure. Comfort didn't answer the questions that hung constantly in the air. What happened to Evan and Jake? Where did they go? Who saw them last? Who or what had taken them away? That winter, on a quiet evening just after Christmas, Ruth placed 2 small candles on the windowsill, one for Evan, one for Jake. She lit them both and sat in the dark, the tiny flames flickering against the cold glass. She stayed there for hours, unmoving, watching the night swallow the light beyond her porch. Somewhere out there, she believed, her boys were still waiting for her. And as another year slipped away, the mystery of the Harper brothers remained frozen, unsolved, untouched, and growing darker with every passing season. The years that followed reshaped the Harper family in ways no one on the outside could fully understand. The disappearance of Evan and Jake didn't just leave an empty space, it became the center point around which every moment, every decision, every memory revolved. Birthdays passed quietly. Their room remained untouched. The boys' drawings stayed pinned on the kitchen wall long after the paper yellowed. Ruth dusted them every Sunday, her hands trembling as she traced the fading crayon lines. Samuel rarely spoke about the boys after that first year. The grief hardened inside him, settling in the lines on his face and the stillness in his voice. He woke early every morning and walked the property alone, following the same paths he'd searched hundreds of times. He checked fence posts for signs, studied the dirt road for tire tracks that weren't there, and stopped at the edge of the woods, as if hoping the boys might suddenly run out laughing, apologizing for hiding so long. But they never did. By the early 1980s, the case had gone cold in the eyes of the sheriff's office. The files were stored on a back shelf, still open, but rarely touched. New crimes, new emergencies, and new tragedies demanded attention. The disappearance of Evan and Jake Harper was whispered about occasionally, usually by older townspeople who remembered the search, but for most, life moved on. Except for the Harpers. In 1983, a new deputy named Tom Granger joined the sheriff's office. Young, determined, and idealistic, Tom read through the cold case files on his own time, fascinated and troubled by the lack of resolution. He visited the Harpers, sat with them at their kitchen table, and listened to their memories of that day. Ruth spoke quietly, answering every question Tom asked. Samuel listened in silence, only occasionally adding a detail, a time, a direction, a noise he'd never been sure about. Tom left with a renewed determination, convinced that somewhere in those old papers, somewhere in the overlooked statements or forgotten tips, lay the key to unlocking the mystery. He dug into the old theories again. He reviewed the report about the blue pickup on the logging road, even driving the route himself. He interviewed the elderly neighbor once more about the shadows she'd seen along the fence line. He tracked down the farmhand who'd left town suddenly that summer, speaking to him hundreds of miles away. Every lead ran dry. Every path ended at the same empty place. Still, Tom wasn't ready to let the case go. He reached out to departments in nearby counties, asking whether any unidentified remains found in the last decade matched two young boys from the 1970s. The answer was always no. For a brief moment, hope returned to the Harper home. They weren't alone anymore. Someone was still looking. But even Tom couldn't fight time. In the mid-1980s, he was pulled into a series of events in the county. Drug cases, robberies, a missing teenage girl. The old cold case was pushed aside once more. Tom visited the Harpers occasionally, but each visit grew shorter, each update thinner. And slowly, another decade slipped away. By the 1990s, the Harper farm had aged. The paint on the house peeled. The barn roof sagged. The fields grew less vibrant as Samuel struggled to maintain them. Friends and neighbors drifted to new towns or new lives. Yet every night, Ruth lit 2 candles in the window, one for Evan, one for Jake. People in Red Oak began to call them the Lanterns, a symbol of the family's refusal to let their boys fade into memory. Truck drivers passing through at late hours mentioned seeing the soft glow on the hill. Some locals said it was beautiful. Others said it broke their heart. In 1997, a regional TV station aired a short segment on unsolved cases in Georgia. The Harper brothers were briefly mentioned. A reporter stood in front of the overgrown logging road, summarizing the disappearance in less than a minute. The broadcast brought a small wave of calls to the sheriff's office, mostly false sightings or old rumors, but it stirred something in the community. People who had been children at the time suddenly felt the weight of what had been lost. Yet still, no answers emerged. As the new millennium approached, the Harper case had spanned generations, a mystery older than some of the deputies now working the force, older than many of the townspeople who heard the story whispered for the first time. And for the Harpers, now gray-haired and worn, the question remained as sharp and painful as the day the boys vanished. Where were Evan and Jake? What happened to them? How could an entire lifetime pass without a single clue? On the eve of the year 2000, Ruth stood at the window watching fireworks flicker across the distant horizon, their colors reflecting faintly in the glass. She leaned her forehead against the cold pane, eyes drifting toward the porch light, the fields, the barn. She whispered their names one more time, just as she had done for 26 years. Evan, Jake, come home. But the night remained still, and the answers remained hidden. As the 2000s unfolded, a new wave of interest in cold cases swept across the country. Television networks launched true crime shows. The internet gave rise to online forums, and everyday people began discussing mysteries once forgotten by time. And slowly, the disappearance of Evan and Jake Harper resurfaced, not in official records, but in living rooms, and message boards, and the memories of those who still carried the story. By this time, the Harpers were aging visibly. Samuel's hands, once strong from decades of farm work, trembled when he picked up tools. Ruth moved slower, her steps soft and careful. The farm had grown quieter. Many of the animals were gone. Some fields were left unplanted. But inside the house, nothing had changed. The boys' room was still kept neat. Their belongings remained untouched. On the small wooden dresser, an old toy airplane rested at the same angle Evan had left it. A faded baseball glove sat beside Jake's neatly folded shirts. Dust settled, but nothing was ever moved. Ruth continued to light 2 candles every night. The flames flickered against the window, seen by anyone passing through the long stretch of road in front of the Harper home. Some said the candles were a symbol of hope. Others believed they were a reminder, a soft, glowing sign that the boys had never been forgotten. In 2003, a distant relative posted a brief summary of the case on an early internet forum dedicated to missing children. The post didn't gain much attention at first, but it sparked a discussion among a handful of amateur investigators. They debated theories, examined maps of the Harper property, and speculated about suspects who might have been involved. For the first time in years, strangers from across the country were talking about Evan and Jake again. A volunteer group reached out to the sheriff's office and asked for permission to review old case files. They hoped fresh eyes might catch something overlooked decades earlier. The sheriff agreed, providing redacted copies of statements, maps, and old search records. The group studied every page, but nothing jumped out. The lines drawn on the maps were thorough. The search perimeters were wide. The interviews were detailed. The sheriff in 1974 had done everything he could with the tools available at the time. Still, the online discussions continued. Some users believed the boys had been abducted by a stranger who drove through the area rarely enough to avoid suspicion. Others insisted someone local must have been involved, someone who knew the family's routines and the layout of the property. One user proposed a chilling idea. What if the boys were taken by someone they trusted? That question stayed with many. In 2008, the sheriff's office performed an administrative review of several unresolved cases from the 1970s and 80s. The Harper file was pulled off the shelf once more. A handful of deputies gathered in a conference room and spread the documents across a long table. They re-examined everything: the timeline, witness accounts, seasonal factors, potential routes in and out of the property. They even looked into regional offenders whose records weren't digitized back then. Again, no breakthrough. But something changed. A young deputy named Sarah McConnell couldn't shake the case. She was around the same age Evan would have been if he'd lived. She imagined what it must have felt like for two young boys to walk across their own farm and disappear into thin air. That kind of mystery didn't feel like a case. It felt like a wound. Sarah visited the Harper farm herself. Ruth greeted her at the door, frail but polite. The house smelled of cinnamon and old cedar wood. Family photos lined the walls, many of them featuring Evan and Jake in the years before the disappearance. Sarah noticed the candles in the window. "They're for my boys," Ruth said softly, following her gaze. "I keep them lit so they can find their way home." Sarah nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. She spent hours talking with the Harpers. She listened more than she spoke, letting Ruth recount memories, some warm, some painful. Samuel added details only when necessary, his voice heavy with decades of exhaustion. When Sarah left that day, she promised to keep digging, even if the chances of finding answers were slim. Meanwhile, the internet continued to breathe life into the case. A user on a missing persons forum uploaded a scanned newspaper clipping from 1974, showing two small, grainy photos of Evan and Jake. The post spread, shared by hundreds of people. Soon, a true crime blogger wrote an article titled, "The Vanishing on West Pasture Road." The story circulated widely. By the early 2010s, videos, posts, and threads began appearing, small digital footprints keeping the memory alive. But none of these efforts, online or offline, brought closure. In 2014, tragedy struck the Harper family again. Samuel passed away quietly in his sleep after nearly 40 years of searching, waiting, and hoping for a truth he never received. At the funeral, Ruth placed two small candles on his casket, a final gesture symbolizing the family he never stopped longing to complete. Ruth's health declined quickly after Samuel's passing. She remained in the farmhouse, cared for by relatives and neighbors. Even as her memory faded, even when she no longer remembered some names or dates, she still remembered her boys. On her last Christmas, she whispered the same words she had whispered thousands of nights before. "Evan, Jake, Mama's here." Ruth passed away quietly in 2016, surrounded by family photos and the familiar glow of two candles on the windowsill. Their deaths didn't close the case. If anything, the loss of the parents added a new layer of urgency among those who still cared. It felt wrong for the truth to die with the people who suffered the most. In the years that followed, the story of the Harper brothers continued to circulate online. Podcasts mentioned the case. Amateur investigators pieced together timelines. Missing persons databases included their profiles. And every new post, video, or discussion carried the same cold and painful reality. After decades of searching, no trace of Evan or Jake Harper had ever been found. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. And yet, even after all this time, the case refused to fade into silence. Some mysteries grow weaker with age. This one only grew stronger. The story of the Harper brothers gained its biggest resurgence of attention in the late 2010s, when true crime communities on YouTube and Reddit began compiling unsolved cases from rural America. Their disappearance, once a fading memory of a small Georgia town, was suddenly being examined by thousands of people around the world. One particularly active forum user created a detailed timeline of the day the boys went missing, pulling together everything from weather reports to the sheriff's notes to eyewitness statements. Others contributed old newspaper scans, satellite maps, and handwritten theories. Within weeks, the case had an entire dedicated thread packed with speculation. Some of those theories were familiar: suspected strangers, hidden wells, accidents, but others were new, more intricate, more unsettling. A few users believed the boys were abducted by someone passing through the county. They pointed to the blue pickup spotted on the logging road, suggesting it might belong to a traveling laborer or a drifter heading north. They mapped potential routes the truck could have taken, noting how easy it would be to vanish into the interstate system, just 2 towns over. But that theory raised another question. How did the driver approach the boys without being seen? The farm was open, flat, and quiet. Anyone approaching from the road would have been noticeable. Another group of users focused on the neighbor who reported seeing shadows along the fence line. They wondered whether the boys had wandered beyond the barn, possibly following someone or something. But without any physical evidence, the idea was difficult to support. A darker theory emerged involving someone the boys may have known, someone who could have driven onto the property without drawing suspicion. Several names were tossed around from the old sheriff's notes, including former farmhands, distant relatives, and neighbors with questionable reputations. But nothing substantial connected them to the disappearance. Then there was a more philosophical idea, the silent abduction theory. This one argued that the absence of physical evidence indicated a swift, controlled event, something that lasted seconds, not minutes, something that required planning, timing, and an understanding of the property. Whatever had happened, it had been quiet enough that Ruth, working in the kitchen only a short distance away, didn't hear a thing. In 2019, a small true crime channel featured the Harper brothers in a 20-minute video, which unexpectedly reached more than 500,000 views. Listeners became captivated by the eerie details, the open farmland, the lack of clues, the decades of silence. Suddenly, the sheriff's office began receiving calls again. Tips, questions, sightings, claims of memories long buried. Most of the calls led nowhere, but the renewed interest caught the attention of a different group, DNA genealogists. One genealogist reached out to the Harpers' distant relatives, offering to help submit DNA to national databases. The idea wasn't to find the boys directly. So much time had passed that the chances were low, but to see whether any unidentified remains in the region might match. The process was slow. Many samples didn't have enough data to compare. Some old remains were never preserved properly. Others were already linked to different cases. Then, in early 2021, a genealogist made an intriguing discovery. A set of unidentified child remains found in Alabama in 1978 had never been matched to any known profile. The remains were incomplete and had degraded significantly, but enough material existed for a comparison. It took months for the test results to come back. By the time the call came from the lab, the genealogist's hands shook as she opened the email. The remains were not a match. Some saw that as another dead end. But others, including the online communities, saw something else entirely. If those remains weren't the Harper brothers, then the boys hadn't died in that part of Alabama. That narrowed certain theories. It closed certain doors. It forced investigators to look elsewhere. new possibilities emerged. What if the boys had been taken far from Georgia? What if they had been separated? What if one or both had survived beyond childhood? On forums, users began cross-referencing unidentified children across the entire southeastern United States. Cases from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Florida were compared with every detail available about Evan and Jake. None of them matched exactly, and so the mystery deepened. In 2022, Deputy Sarah McConnell, now a lead investigator, requested a full digital archiving of the Harper case files. She scanned every paper, every map, every note, and uploaded them into a searchable system. It was the first time anyone had been able to search all documents at once. One night, as she sat alone in her office reviewing old statements, something caught her attention. A detail buried in the original notes from 1974. A remark so small it had probably been overlooked by everyone who had ever touched the case. It mentioned a man who had been seen walking near the edge of the Harper property the week before the disappearance. He'd been described as quiet, polite, and unknown to the area. A traveler, possibly a hired laborer, looking for seasonal work. Ruth had spoken to him briefly when he asked for water from the kitchen spigot. He had never been seen again after that day. The details weren't new. It had been logged before. But what struck Sarah was something else. A recent entry in a national database noting a similar description of a man connected to an unrelated missing persons case from the 1970s. It might have been a coincidence. It might have been nothing. But in a case with almost nothing to work with, even a whisper of a connection felt like a spark. Sarah printed both records and laid them side by side on her desk. The similarities were vague, but not impossible. And if the same man had been passing through Georgia in 1974 and through another county with a missing child a few years later, it could shift the focus of the case in an entirely new direction. She stared at the papers, wondering whether this was the first real lead in decades, or just another dead end waiting to disappoint everyone once again. Whatever the truth was, it was still out there. And after nearly 50 years, the Harper brothers' story was about to enter its most uncertain phase yet. Sarah didn't want to get ahead of herself. She'd seen too many investigators chase shadows, only to end up right back where they started. But something about this man, the traveler asking for water, stayed with her. Not because he was suspicious on his own, but because he had slipped so easily through the cracks. She began digging. Public records from the 1970s were scattered and inconsistent. Some counties had digitized everything. Others still kept files in metal cabinets and dusty cardboard boxes. Sarah made calls, sent emails, and requested old notes from departments across Georgia and neighboring states. Most responses came back with nothing. But one county sheriff's office, 2 hours west of Red Oak, eventually found a partial transcript from the late 70s involving a missing child case. The transcript mentioned a quiet drifter working odd jobs who had been questioned after a local boy went missing. No arrest was made. No evidence linked him definitively to the case. He had simply moved on before deputies could question him again. A drifter. Polite. Quiet. Not from around here. The descriptions overlapped just enough for Sarah to feel a chill. Still, it wasn't evidence. It wasn't even a real lead. It was a whisper of a possibility. But a whisper was more than the Harper case had seen in decades. She pulled up maps of rural Georgia from 1974, tracing potential routes a traveler might have taken. Dirt roads that didn't exist anymore. logging paths long overgrown, old rail lines used by freight companies. It was entirely possible, and sadly common, that men passed through these areas without leaving any record behind. She needed more. So she turned to the smallest details, the ones investigators rarely revisited. In the original notes from Ruth's statement, it said the man carried a canvas bag and had a soft southern accent. He wore worn-out boots, a wrinkled shirt, and carried a folded map in his pocket. There was something odd about that last note, a folded map. In 1974, locals didn't use maps to navigate Red Oak. They knew every bend in every road. A map meant he wasn't from the area at all, or wasn't planning to stay. Sarah circled the detail in red ink. Meanwhile, online communities began circulating the new hints leaking from the ongoing review. Someone posted an old newspaper photo of the Harper farm, sparking speculation about blind spots and escape routes. Others analyzed aerial maps, debating whether the boys could have been lured toward the woods or the road without being seen. But the most active thread focused on the mysterious traveling man. Some believed he might have been completely unrelated. Others feared he might have been connected to similar disappearances in the region, a theory impossible to prove without more evidence. One user, claiming to be a retired truck driver, said he remembered picking up hitchhikers throughout Georgia in the early 70s. One of them, he said, was a soft-spoken man who fit the description perfectly. But the man had said little, offered no last name, and carried very little with him besides a canvas bag and an old paper map. The truck driver recalled dropping him off at a crossroads not far from Red Oak. Sarah read that comment 3 times before emailing the user privately. He couldn't remember the exact date. He couldn't remember the man's face clearly. But he remembered one specific thing. The stranger said he was heading to Alabama. That matched the general direction the blue truck sighting had pointed toward. Again, it wasn't proof, but the threads were aligning in ways that were difficult to ignore. With this in mind, Sarah contacted a federal database coordinator who specialized in linking unidentified persons across state lines. She asked whether they could cross-reference descriptions of unidentified remains from the 70s and 80s with the traveler's rough physical traits. The coordinator agreed to run a preliminary search. Weeks passed with no word. Then one morning, an email arrived. A single set of unidentified remains, found in northern Alabama in 1975, matched the approximate age, height, and general description of the drifter. There was no DNA available for comparison. Identification had never been made, but the description aligned more closely than any other record discovered so far. Sarah stared at the screen. If this was the same man who came to the Harper farm, if he had died a year after the boys vanished, if he had taken secrets to his grave, then the trail might end there. But it also meant something else. If he was involved, he hadn't stayed in Georgia long after the disappearance. Not long enough to risk being recognized. Not long enough to be questioned. The theory left Sarah torn. If the drifter was responsible, then the boys might never have left the region. They might have been hidden nearby, within walking distance, within the reach of the search teams who'd been combing the fields. That thought made her sick. But there was another possibility, one she kept quietly to herself. What if the drifter wasn't a kidnapper, but a witness? What if he had seen something on the property that day? What if he was the third shadow, the elderly neighbor thought she saw. And then, what if someone else silenced him? The lack of evidence made every theory feel fragile, unstable. Still, one truth became clearer with every new discovery. The missing pieces of the Harper case were scattered far beyond Red Oak. As Sarah continued her work, an eerie realization settled over her. Every time she got close to a possible answer, it led to someone who had died, disappeared, or vanished from record entirely. It was as though the truth itself was slipping further away with each passing year. And yet, despite decades of darkness, one stubborn hope remained. If the right clue surfaced, just one, everything could change. Because unsolved doesn't mean forgotten, and unanswered doesn't mean the truth isn't out there. As Sarah expanded her search beyond Georgia, she began noticing a pattern, small, subtle, and easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Several unsolved cases involving young children across the Southeast shared a handful of similarities: rural settings, quiet afternoons, and disappearances without signs of struggle. Most of these cases were unrelated, scattered across different states and years. But three of them, two in Alabama, one in Mississippi, all occurred within a 12-year span. Each incident involved children vanishing from or near farmland. Each occurred during daylight hours. Each left almost no physical evidence behind. The cases were too far apart to draw conclusions. Yet the resemblance was unsettling. Sarah contacted officials involved in those old investigations. Some departments had merged, files were missing, and many of the original officers had retired. But she managed to gather enough fragments to see a troubling possibility. The Harper brothers' disappearance might not have been an isolated event. Even so, this theory wasn't universally accepted. Some investigators argued that rural missing children cases often looked similar simply because of the environment. Dense woods, isolated properties, lack of witnesses. These factors alone could explain the similarities. But Sarah wasn't convinced it was just coincidence. Her instincts told her something else had been moving through those regions in the 1970s. Someone familiar with back roads, someone able to approach quietly, someone capable of disappearing without a trace. Still, without evidence, all she had were educated guesses. While Sarah continued digging, the online community was evolving too. A popular true crime podcast dedicated an episode to the Harper brothers after learning about her renewed investigation. The episode quickly went viral, bringing tens of thousands of new listeners to the case. Emails flooded the sheriff's office. People shared memories, theories, and old stories. Some messages were emotional. Parents who felt connected to the case, siblings who knew the pain of losing someone without answers. Others were cryptic, claiming to have seen something decades ago but offering little detail. Most messages led nowhere. But one email, sent by a man living in Tennessee, stood out. He said he'd grown up in Georgia and remembered traveling with his father through Red Oak in the early 70s. He didn't recall the Harpers specifically, but he remembered something strange. A man on the side of the road waving at cars with a canvas bag at his feet. The man's description matched the drifter almost perfectly. The email ended with a single line that made Sarah pause. He wasn't hitchhiking. He looked like he was waiting for someone. That detail gnawed at her. Waiting for someone. Not asking for a ride. Waiting. She forwarded the message to the federal database coordinator and began cross-referencing dates. The timeline was tight, but possible. If the drifter had been in the area a week before the boys vanished, he could have been waiting at the crossroads for a contact, someone else traveling through the region. A second person, one no one had ever identified. This new angle made the case feel even more tangled. If two people had been involved, the disappearance might have been planned. That would explain the silence, the lack of physical evidence, the speed of the event. But it also raised an even more painful question. Why Evan and Jake? Why those boys on that day, at that moment? Sarah tried to imagine the boys' final steps, the path from the house to the barn, the sharp turn toward the west pasture, the way the sun would have lit the fields behind them. She imagined the silence. She imagined the stillness. She imagined how quickly two small lives could be erased if the wrong eyes were watching. Around this time, a retired FBI profiler reached out after hearing the podcast episode. He had never worked on the Harper case, but he offered his insight based on decades of experience. He said something that stayed with Sarah. In cases with no evidence, look for people who blend into the background. Someone the community didn't think twice about. It was a chilling notion. Someone blending in could mean a harmless traveler, or someone familiar. A neighbor, a passerby, someone who'd visited the farm before. It could mean anyone. Late one evening, while reviewing the case files again, Sarah found herself staring at the map of the Harper property. Her eyes drifted to the west pasture, the last place the boys were seen. There was something unusual about that spot, a natural dip in the land that made it invisible from the house. A small blind area where someone could stand unnoticed, a perfect place to intercept two children. She marked the area with a red circle and leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. The case feels different now. Not just tragic, not just mysterious, but deliberate. It wasn't proof. She still had no names, no vehicle, no physical trace. But for the first time since the case reopened, she felt she was facing in the right direction. Outside the sheriff's office, wind rustled through the trees. The world had moved on from 1974, but the fields where Evan and Jake once ran remained untouched by time. Somewhere in those acres, the truth still waited. Maybe buried, maybe forgotten, maybe hiding behind a single piece of evidence that had never been found. And as Sarah closed the files for the night, she whispered the question that had haunted Red Oak for nearly 50 years. Where are those boys? The silence offered no answer. It never had. Winter settled heavily over Red Oak the year Sarah identified the blind spot in the west pasture. The fields, once bright with summer corn, were now muted under frost. The Harper property looked frozen in time, quiet, still, untouched. Almost too untouched. It was around this time that a new piece of information surfaced, not from a witness, not from an old file, but from an anonymous letter. It arrived at the sheriff's office on a cold morning in early January. No return address, no name. The handwriting was shaky, but deliberate. Each letter pressed deeply into the paper, as if written by someone whose hands trembled. It contained only one sentence. They were taken west. No explanation, no signature, just that. Sarah read the note 3 times before showing it to the sheriff. They dusted it for fingerprints. None. The envelope carried a generic stamp sold everywhere in the region. The paper was cheap, unremarkable, available at any store. A dead end on its surface. But Sarah couldn't ignore the direction. West. It matched the witness who had seen shadows along the fence line. It matched the old logging road. It matched several theories whispered online. It also matched the direction the drifter was reportedly traveling. She pinned the note on her board, one more fragment in a mosaic of uncertainty. As weeks passed, Sarah dug deeper into the land west of the Harper farm. Much of it was forested in 1974, but over the decades, it had changed, sold, cleared, replanted, developed, abandoned. Property records became a labyrinth of ownership transfers. Several key parcels belonged to people who had long since died or moved away. Still, she traced every owner, every tenant, every farmer, every hunter. One name caught her attention: Daniel H. Grayson. He owned a large tract of land west of the Harpers during the 1970s. Grayson had been in his early 30s back then, a quiet man with no criminal record, but known for taking in seasonal workers, drifters, and laborers passing through. His property bordered the same logging road where the blue pickup had been spotted. Sarah requested old employment records from Grayson's now defunct farm. Only one document survived, a faded ledger, listing first names only, no surnames. One of the entries from May 1974 read, March, hired, Eli, traveling laborer, quiet, kept to himself. June, Eli gone. The boys disappeared in July. A chill ran through Sarah. Eli wasn't a common alias, but it was a common false one. She felt, for the first time, that she was brushing against the outline of the truth. She expanded her search for any mention of Eli in regional records. There were dozens of men with that name, but one stood out: a man arrested in Alabama in 1975 for vagrancy. The details were incomplete, but the description matched the drifter almost exactly. Height, build, southern accent, canvas bag. And then she found something else, a note in a deputy's margin. Subject claimed to have worked farms in GA last summer, left before trouble started. Before trouble started. Trouble. In Georgia. Last summer. Sarah sat back, pulse rising. She checked another file, unrelated at the time. A police report from a small county in Mississippi about a suspicious man, seen near a school. No crime committed, no arrest made. The description matched again. Same build, same accent, canvas bag. He had been moving in a straight line across multiple states. If this Eli was indeed the drifter, if he had been involved in disappearances, and if he truly died in 1975, as one set of unidentified remains suggested, then the Harper brothers' trail died with him. But Sarah wasn't satisfied. She needed more. She needed something undeniable, something physical. By now, the online community had exploded with the new findings, though nothing official had been released. Amateur sleuths pieced together every clue, some correctly, others wildly off course. But one user, a retired land surveyor, made a stunning observation. He overlaid a 1974 aerial map with current satellite imagery and discovered something unexpected: a hollow now filled with brush and debris that didn't appear on modern maps. A hollow less than 600 yards west of the Harper property, right in the blind spot, right where the shadows had been seen, right where someone could have waited without being noticed. Sarah drove to the area the next morning, the cold numbing her fingers as she pushed through thorny vines and fallen limbs. The hollow was deeper than she expected, almost like a bowl carved into the earth. The ground was loose from decades of erosion, and as she stepped closer, something caught her eye. A shard of rusted metal, an old buckle, a fragment of cloth buried in the dirt, weathered, decayed, impossible to identify, but unmistakably old. Sarah pulled on gloves, kneeling carefully. She brushed away layers of soil with slow, deliberate movements. Her breath hitched. There were bones. Small ones. Fragments. Breakable. Scattered. Worn by time. She froze. Human remains or animal? She couldn't say. Not yet. But her instincts screamed one thing. This hollow was not empty. This hollow held secrets. It took hours, but she marked the site and called the sheriff. The area was sealed off. Forensic teams arrived, anthropologists, cadaver dogs. And as night fell over Red Oak, their lights illuminated something that made Sarah's knees buckle. A second bone, then a third, then something else. A piece of aged leather, possibly from a child's shoe. No one spoke at first. The air felt too heavy. Everyone knew what this might mean, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Not yet, because if these remains belonged to Evan and Jake Harper, then the 50-year question had finally been answered. But if they didn't, then the nightmare was far from over. And someone else's story had just risen from the dirt. The discovery at the hollow spread through the sheriff's office like wildfire. Within hours, word leaked to a few locals. By the next morning, Red Oak was buzzing, quietly, cautiously, almost fearfully, about bones found on the old Harper property line. People spoke in hushed tones in gas station lines, at diner counters, in church foyers. Could it be them? After all these years? What if it's not? No one dared to assume. No one dared to hope. No one dared to fear the answer. The sheriff imposed a tight perimeter around the site. A small line of patrol cars marked the edge of the woods, and yellow tape fluttered in the cold wind. Forensics tents were set up, their white walls glowing softly in the gray winter air. Sarah arrived before dawn. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were tired, but focused, locked onto the hollow as if it were staring back at her. A forensic anthropologist, Dr. Elaine Porter, knelt beside the exposed remains. She was a calm, steady woman in her 60s, meticulous and unshakable. She had worked on dozens of historic recovery cases, but even she seemed tense. Sarah approached quietly. "Anything new?" she asked. Dr. Porter lifted her head, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We found more fragments overnight, but it's too early to say whether they're human or animal." Sarah nodded, swallowing disappointment. "And the shoe?" she asked. Dr. Porter hesitated. "It's old, very old, but leather doesn't tell us who wore it." The silence stretched. Sarah stared at the excavation site. The dark soil, the debris, the untouched layers of earth that had been hiding something for half a century. The sheriff joined them shortly after. "We need to be cautious," he said. "If we announce anything before confirmation, we won't," Sarah replied. "Not until we know." By midday, cadaver dogs signaled in 2 additional areas around the hollow. Small hits, not full alerts, but enough to expand the dig radius. More bones surfaced, small, fragmented, scattered by decades of erosion. Not enough to identify, enough to unsettle. As the forensic team worked, Sarah stepped back, studying the bigger picture. Something bothered her, deeply. The location. This hollow wasn't a random dump site. It wasn't hidden enough for a panicked killer. It wasn't deep enough to be intentional. It felt more like a place where something, or someone, had been carried, or dragged. She traced the slope with her eyes. If someone approached from the logging road, the hollow would have been the first depression they hit when cutting across the land. She imagined the scene in 1974. 2 boys walking, a figure emerging, a struggle. or no struggle at all. Two small silhouettes disappearing into the trees. Her stomach twisted. What happened here? Late in the afternoon, Dr. Porter called her back over. "We've separated the remains," she said. "Some are definitely animal. Deer, possibly. But these—" She held up two small bone fragments in gloved hands. "These are human." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. Her voice wavered. "Can you estimate the age?" Dr. Porter's expression softened. "I can tell you they're from a child. Possibly two." Sarah closed her eyes. It was the closest anyone had come to the truth in 49 years. A few feet away, a deputy pulled something else from the soil. A rusted metal object, flat and bent. Sarah took it carefully. "What is that?" the sheriff asked. She brushed away the dirt, revealing raised lettering. It was part of a toy. A small piece of tin from a wind-up airplane. Its paint long gone, but its shape unmistakable. Sarah's breath caught. She knew that object. She had seen it before, photographed in the Harper family album on her first visit. Evan's favorite toy airplane. The confirmation hit her like a blow. It was them. It had to be them. The boys had been here. And suddenly, Sarah felt something unexpected. Anger. Not sharp, not explosive, but cold, heavy, rising from the gut like something awakened. Who did this? Why here? Why them? But the discovery brought a new, alarming complication. The remains were scattered, weathered, broken, mixed with soil. Impossible to map cleanly. This wasn't a grave. This was a place where something had happened, something violent and hurried. As evening approached, the sheriff called the team together. "Collect everything," he said. "We take nothing for granted." Sarah looked out toward the tree line, where the boys once played freely among the tall grass. She imagined their voices echoing across the fields, their laughter bouncing off the barn walls. That laughter had been swallowed by this hollow. She clenched her fists. "We're close," she said quietly. "Closer than anyone has ever been." Dr. Porter nodded. "Closer, but not finished." The site would need days, maybe weeks, to fully process. DNA could confirm the remains. Environmental tests could age them. Tool marks, if any existed, might tell a story long buried. But as Sarah stepped away, she noticed something else. A narrow indentation in the soil, barely visible. Straight, angular, purposeful. A trench line. Not natural, not accidental. Something had been dragged or buried there. Her heart pounded as she traced it with her glove. The trench pointed west. The same direction as the anonymous letter. The same direction as the drifter's last route. The same direction the boys were believed to have gone. West. Always west. A pattern too strong to ignore. A message too clear to misinterpret. Whoever took the Harper brothers led them in only one direction. And for the first time, Sarah felt the faint but unmistakable presence of the truth. Not approaching slowly, but advancing, coming for them, and it would not stay buried much longer. Night fell over the Harper property, but no one went home. Floodlights surrounded the hollow like glowing sentinels, illuminating the excavation site and casting long, trembling shadows across the frozen ground. Deputies moved quietly, their radios muted, their voices low. No one wanted to break the eerie, almost sacred silence of the place. Sarah stood at the edge of the hollow, her coat pulled tight against the cold wind. She watched as Dr. Porter and her team carefully lifted the newly discovered bone fragments into labeled evidence bags. Each piece was handled with delicate precision, as though the past itself might crumble if touched too harshly. The sheriff approached her slowly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You holding up?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though her jaw was tight. "It feels different now. Real. Heavy. It was always real," he said. "But this is proof." She looked back at the hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. "But proof of what? That they died here? That they were brought here? That someone left them?" The sheriff didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both of them knew that the truth, whatever it was, would be worse than any assumption. Around midnight, cadaver dogs alerted again, this time at the far edge of the trench line Sarah had spotted earlier. Forensics moved quickly, clearing brush with careful hands. Within minutes, someone called out, "Over here! Something else!" Sarah rushed over, her heart pounding. Half buried beneath compacted soil lay a second object. Not a toy, not clothing, metal, rusty, rectangular, a license plate, old, bent, the paint nearly gone, but part of the number was still visible. Sarah felt her veins go cold. It wasn't Georgia. It wasn't even Alabama. It was Mississippi, 3 counties over from where another child had gone missing in 1971. Her mind raced. Was it dropped accidentally? Did it fall off a vehicle? Was it buried on purpose? A forensic tech held it up under the floodlight. All the sound seemed to drain from the air. "This plate was torn off," he said. "Not removed, torn." Sarah stared at the jagged edge, where metal had been ripped away by force. Whether from a crash, a struggle, or something else entirely. The sheriff exhaled sharply. "If this belonged to our drifter, then he wasn't alone," Sarah finished. "Someone driving a Mississippi-tagged vehicle was here. Someone who may have been using back roads across multiple states." She turned, scanning the dark woods, as if the trees themselves might reveal the past. "This isn't just a local case," she said. "Whoever took the boys, they moved, they traveled. This was not their first time." Dr. Porter approached, her expression grave. "We've separated the remains," she said softly. "There are at least 2 distinct sets of child-sized bones. I can't confirm age or identity yet, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I believe they are consistent with 2 boys between ages 6 and 10. Sarah's breath left her body in a single, painful exhale. That was the age of Evan and Jake. The sheriff placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to confirm with DNA," he said. "We're going to do this the right way." Sarah nodded slowly. But inside, her thoughts spiraled. What if these weren't the boys? What if this hollow held other victims? What if the Harper brothers were still out there, buried somewhere else entirely? The uncertainty cut deeper than any truth. As the team prepared to shut down operations for the night, Sarah walked toward the property line and stopped at the fence, looking west. The sky shimmered with faint starlight. West. That direction again. That word again. That path again. She whispered into the darkness, "Where did you take them?" Only the cold wind answered. And far out in the fields, somewhere past the tree line, something creaked, a sound like old wood shifting under unseen weight. Sarah turned sharply, but there was nothing, just shadows. Still, the feeling lingered, a prickling awareness, as if eyes watched from somewhere in the night. Not human, not malicious, just memory. The land itself seemed to remember, and it was beginning to speak. For 3 days, the Harper property became a maze of search grids, floodlights, and forensic markers. The hollow was carefully excavated, inch by inch. Soil was sifted. Roots were clipped and logged. Every fragment was placed in sterile containers. The air carried a heavy mix of cold earth, diesel fumes, and unspoken dread. By the afternoon of the third day, the remains had been transported to the state forensic lab. All that was left to do was wait. Sarah hated waiting. She spent the next 72 hours reviewing every line of the case file. Again, every interview, every map, every rumor, every footstep documented by search volunteers in 1974. At one point, she laid out everything on the floor of the conference room, creating her own massive timeline of the last day the Harper brothers were seen. The sheriff watched quietly from the doorway, understanding her obsession, but unable to ease it. On the fifth day, the call finally came. Not from Dr. Porter, not from the lab, but from the state forensic director himself. Sarah picked up the phone, her pulse pounding. "Agent McConnell?" "Yes. We have preliminary results." She held her breath. The remains recovered from the hollow belonged to 2 children. Her knees weakened. She gripped the table for balance. He continued, "Both children were male, both under the age of 10. "Are they Evan and Jake Harper?" she whispered. There was a long pause, longer than it should have been. "No," the director said quietly. "They are not the Harper boys." Sarah froze. "What?" "They're not a DNA match to the Harper family." Her brain scrambled for logic. 2 children, 2 boys, buried on the Harper property line. But not the Harpers? It didn't make sense. "Are you absolutely sure?" "Positive. We ran the profiles twice. They belong to 2 unidentified boys who are not related to the Harper family." Her throat tightened. "Then who are they?" "We don't know." Sarah ended the call and stared at the wall, the words echoing through her mind. Not the Harper boys. The sheriff stepped in when he saw her trembling. "What is it?" he asked. "They're not Evan and Jake," she said. "They found 2 boys, but they're not them." For a moment, the sheriff didn't move, didn't breathe. Then his jaw clenched. "My God!" The realization hit them both at once. If the boys in the hollow weren't Evan and Jake, then the Harper brothers were still missing, still unaccounted for, still out there. And the hollow belonged to someone else's children. Someone else who had been searching for nearly 50 years. Someone else who never knew what happened to their boys. Sarah felt sick. She turned to the sheriff, her voice cracking. "This wasn't just a burial site," she said. "This was a dumping ground." The sheriff rubbed his face with both hands. "So we're dealing with multiple victims." Sarah nodded. "And possibly," she added, "the same person who took Evan and Jake." The weight of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Multiple victims, multiple states, multiple years. The drifter wasn't a lone wanderer. The Mississippi plate wasn't a coincidence. The anonymous letter wasn't random. This was bigger, darker, older. Sarah walked back to the evidence table and lifted the rusted Mississippi license plate with gloved hands. What if the Mississippi case in 1971, the Alabama case in 1975, and the Harper disappearance in 1974 are all the same offender, she whispered. The sheriff swallowed hard. Then we're not just reopening one cold case, he said. We're reopening a trail of unsolved child abductions spanning at least 3 states. Sarah steadied her breathing, her mind racing. The hollow had exposed the truth, a truth no one was prepared for. The Harper boys didn't die here, but others did. And now, after nearly 50 years, a new investigation had begun. Not just into the disappearance of Evan and Jake, but into a predator who had moved silently across the South for more than a decade. A predator no one had ever caught. a predator no one had ever identified. And somewhere in that tangled past, the fate of the Harper brothers was still waiting to be found. The news that the remains in the hollow were not Evan and Jake sent a shockwave through the investigation. What everyone assumed was the ending was suddenly the beginning of something much darker. Two unidentified boys, buried on the Harper property line, killed years ago, killed by someone who was never caught. And if they weren't the Harper brothers, then the Harper brothers' fate was still a mystery. Sarah threw herself into the work with a renewed, almost desperate focus. The hollow had revealed one brutal truth. Whoever took the Harper boys had taken others too. She started with the only clues they had: the Mississippi license plate, the drifter known only as Eli, and the mysterious anonymous letter claiming the boys were taken west. One by one, she pulled at each thread. 1. The license plate. The plate led her to a small county sheriff's office in Mississippi. The record was old, nearly crumbling in its binder, but readable. A 1969 Ford F-100 pickup, blue, with a damaged passenger door. Sarah froze. A damaged passenger door? Just like the truck reported on the logging road the day the Harper boys vanished. She checked the owner's name. Raymond J. Danner, born 1940. Lived in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Convicted burglar suspected in 2 abductions. Never charged. Vanished in 1976. Raymond Danner. She said the name aloud several times, letting the weight settle. A drifter, a criminal. A man who moved through rural counties the same years children disappeared. And his truck matched the one seen near the Harper farm. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the next file. 2. The drifter, Eli. The farm ledger from 1974 listed a seasonal worker named Eli who came and left abruptly. When Sarah compared physical descriptions, something disturbing clicked. They were almost identical. Same height, same build, same southern accent, same canvas bag, same tendency to appear and disappear without notice. And then she saw it. Eli's handwriting in the farm ledger. Sharp, heavy pressure. Letters carved into the page, just like the anonymous letter left at the sheriff's office. She stared at the 2 samples side by side, her breath caught in her throat. Eli wasn't an alias. It was a nickname. A nickname that matched a documented alias of Raymond Danner. Her pulse quickened. Same truck, same handwriting, same regions, same disappearance timeline. It wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was converging. 3. The missing person pattern. Sarah pulled a map onto the table and placed pins where unsolved child disappearances occurred from 1971 to 1976. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Each pin formed a rough triangle. And right in the middle of that triangle, Red Oak. The Harper boys had vanished in the center of what now looked like a predator's hunting range. The sheriff walked into the room and stared at the pattern. My God. His voice was low, shaken. This wasn't a one-time abduction, Sarah said, her voice trembling. This was a series, a route, a pattern. He stepped closer to the map. This Raymond Danner. He's our guy, Sarah said. I'm sure of it. The sheriff hesitated. Except, there's one problem. Sarah already knew what he was about to say. The missing person report she'd read earlier chilled her to the bone. Raymond Eli Danner vanished into thin air in 1976. No arrest, no body, no further sightings. His truck was found abandoned deep in rural Alabama, rusting and empty. Keys still inside, canvas bag in the seat, no blood, no prints, no sign of him. He was gone, as if someone had removed him from the world as quietly as he had removed his victims. The sheriff folded his arms, frowning. So what happened to him? Either he fled, Sarah said quietly, or someone stopped him. The room fell silent. For a long moment, Sarah stared at the map, at the triangle of missing children, at the hollow where 2 had been found, at the place where the Harper brothers vanished. Then she whispered, "What if someone killed him? Someone who knew what he did? Someone who stopped him before he could be caught?" It was a terrifying thought, not just a killer, but a possible vigilante. Someone who knew, back then, exactly who Danner was. And someone who might still be alive. The sheriff exhaled slowly. "Look into anyone who worked the Grayson farm," he said. "Anyone who lived near that logging road. Anyone who might have had a reason to make him disappear." Sarah nodded. But her mind was already racing. There was one more clue she hadn't told the sheriff yet. The part that had been gnawing at her since the forensic call. The unsettling twist. The forensic director had said something else at the end of his report, something she hadn't repeated aloud. "Agent McConnell," he'd said, "there was an unusual secondary detail in the DNA findings." She had asked him what that meant. His reply made her go cold. The 2 unidentified boys, they weren't related to the Harpers. "Yes, I understand that." But they were related to each other. Sarah had felt her heart drop. 2 brothers, 2 boys, taken together, killed together, buried together, just like Evan and Jake. This wasn't random. Someone was collecting siblings. And if Danner had targeted one pair, he may have targeted others. Sarah pressed a hand over her mouth. The hollow wasn't the resting place of the Harper boys. It was the resting place of their predecessors, earlier victims, practice victims. And suddenly, Sarah realized something horrifying. If the unidentified boys were the victims before the Harpers, where were the victims after? If Raymond Danner vanished in 1976, and the killings didn't stop, then someone else took his place. Someone who learned from him. Someone who followed his pattern. Someone who may still be out there. And someone who might know exactly what happened to Evan and Jake Harper. A cold dread tightened around Sarah's chest. The case wasn't closing. It was widening, exploding. And the Harper brothers were still missing in the middle of it all. The days following the DNA results were suffocating. What had started as a hopeful breakthrough collapsed into something far darker. 2 boys buried at the Harper property line were not Evan and Jake, but another pair of brothers murdered decades ago, never identified, and never sought by anyone who knew their names. Someone had buried them there, someone who knew the land, someone who was comfortable enough to return again. Sarah couldn't shake it. The hollow wasn't random. It wasn't a dump site. It was a pattern, a method, a signature, a predator who targeted siblings, pairs, boys between 6 and 10. She pinned every known detail to her investigation board and stared at it until her vision blurred. Raymond Eli Danner was the obvious suspect. His truck matched the witness description. His alias matched the drifter. His movements matched the timeline. His disappearance matched the abrupt end of the early cases. But something didn't sit right. Danner vanished in 1976. But children went missing in that region after that year. Not many, not publicly connected, but enough to make Sarah's skin crawl. The pattern didn't die with Danner. Someone picked it up. Someone who wasn't wandering. Someone who didn't flee. Someone who stayed close. A chilling possibility began forming in her mind. What if Danner wasn't the mastermind, but the accomplice? What if someone else was directing the movements? Choosing the targets? Driving the truck while Danner approached the boys on foot? And what if that someone stayed behind, in Red Oak, long after Danner disappeared? The interview that changed everything, Sarah arranged to speak again with one of the only living people from the original 1974 search, Tom Granger, the deputy who revisited the case in the 1980s. He was in his 70s now, frail but sharp. They sat in his dimly lit living room, the old man wrapped in a heavy flannel jacket. Tom tapped his cane on the floor and spoke slowly. "You found bones out there, didn't you?" Sarah hesitated. "Yes." "Not the Harper boys?" "No." Tom sighed, a long, tired breath that seemed to carry 40 years of sorrow. "They never told us back then everything they knew," he said quietly. "Who?" He looked at her with tired gray eyes. "Ruth and Samuel Harper." Sarah straightened. "What do you mean?" Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Before the boys went missing, the Harpers had trouble with someone." Sarah's pulse jumped. "Who?" "A man who used to work for them. Didn't last long. Caused problems." Sarah felt her fingers grip her notebook tighter. "What was his name?" she asked. Tom shook his head. "I don't know his real name, but everyone called him." Sarah held her breath. "Eli." Her stomach dropped. Tom continued. "Ruth didn't like him. Said he watched the boys too much. Told Samuel she wanted him gone." "Did they fire him?" Sarah asked. "Oh, they did," Tom nodded. "Sent him off the property. Ruth said he didn't take it well." Sarah's hands went cold. "Why wasn't this in the original report?" Tom gave her a pained look. "Because they never told the sheriff. Folks handled things quietly back then. Samuel probably thought he'd scared him off for good." A tremor ran through Sarah. "So, Eli Danner worked on the Harper farm?" she whispered. Tom nodded slowly. "For a short time. Weeks, maybe. But long enough for Ruth to sense something was wrong." Suddenly, everything shifted. The drifter didn't randomly choose the Harper boys. He knew them. He watched them. He was familiar with the land. He wasn't a stranger that day. He was returning to take back what he wanted. Sarah exhaled shakily. But why bury two other boys near the property line? Tom stared at the floor. "That's the part that keeps me up at night. Because if he buried them there before, then the Harpers had a predator living on their land and never knew it." Sarah's heart hammered. "So Danner was the killer?" she asked. Tom shook his head. "No, ma'am, I don't think he acted alone." Sarah froze. "Who else?" "Someone who knew the land better than he did." "Someone from Red Oak?" Tom nodded. "Someone who knew the Harpers. Someone who knew when the boys played outside. Someone who could move through those woods without making a sound." Sarah inhaled sharply. "Who, Tom? Who are you talking about?" Tom's eyes darkened. "There was one man we all thought about," he whispered. "But we dismissed him because he was too close to the family." Sarah leaned in. "Who?" Tom swallowed hard. "Ruth's first cousin," he said. "A man named Owen Miller." Sarah blinked. "I know that name." "He lived next door," Tom said. "Small cabin. Quiet type. Hunting guide. He knew every trail in those woods. Every dip in that land. Every blind spot." Sarah stared. "Owen moved away in 1977, she said slowly. "Yes," Tom whispered, "right after Danner vanished." Her heart thundered in her chest. "And where did he move?" Tom's voice dropped to barely a breath. "Mississippi." Sarah felt the world tilt. Mississippi. The license plate, the truck, the pattern. Owen Miller wasn't helping Danner. Owen Miller was the one in charge. Danner was the lure. Miller was the hunter. And the Harper boys. were the last children who saw him. Sarah's voice trembled. "Where is Owen Miller now?" Tom looked at her, his expression grave. "Oh, he's alive," he said. "He's been alive this whole time." Sarah felt ice crawl down her spine. "Where?" Tom tapped his cane on the floor 3 times, a slow, ominous rhythm. "He moved back to Georgia in 1994. Sarah's breath caught. "And now?" she whispered. Tom looked her in the eyes. "He lives 8 miles from here." The room went still, silent, deadly. And somewhere deep in the woods, west of the Harper farm, a man who had escaped suspicion for nearly 50 years was still living free, still hunting, and still holding the secret of what happened to Evan and Jake Harper. Sarah drove the county road with her jaw clenched, the sky bleeding orange behind the tree line. 8 miles from the Harper farm, 8 miles from the hollow, 8 miles from the graves of 2 unidentified boys, and 8 miles from the man who had escaped suspicion for 49 years. Owen Miller. She turned onto a narrow gravel drive lined with overgrown brush. A small weathered cabin sat at the end, half hidden under the shadow of the forest. Smoke curled from the chimney. A faint glow flickered through the front window. Owen was home. Sarah approached the porch slowly, her hand hovering near her weapon but not drawing it. This wasn't an arrest, not yet. She needed information. She needed truth. She knocked once. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. An old man stood there, gray beard, sharp eyes. Too sharp for someone his age. He didn't look confused. He didn't look surprised. He only looked ready. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said. "Evening," he replied calmly. Her heart pounded. He knew why she was here. "I'm following up on a 1974 case," she said carefully. He nodded once, almost approvingly. "The Harper boys," he said. Her chest tightened. "Yes." Owen stepped aside. "Come in." Something about the way he said it made every instinct in her body scream to walk away. But she entered. The cabin was simple. Wood walls, hunting trophies, a coffee pot warming on a stove, no family photos, no personal touches. Only the bare essentials of someone who spent most of his life outside. Owen sat in a rocking chair by the window. "You've been out at that hollow," he said. "You found the boys." Sarah didn't respond. He stared out through the glass at the tree line, as if watching ghosts only he could see. "They weren't the Harpers," he added softly. "No," Sarah said quietly. He rocked once, slowly. "It's something, ain't it? How long they been lying out there?" "Who were they, Owen?" "Don't know their names," he murmured. "But I know they didn't deserve what happened." Sarah stepped closer. "Did you bury them?" He didn't answer. The silence said enough. "Why?" she whispered. The rocking chair stopped. "There's evil in this world, Agent," he said. "And there's men who bring it in with them?" Sarah felt her pulse racing. "Raymond Danner?" Owen's jaw tightened. "He was the one who took 'em. Took a lot of boys. He brought them here. I didn't know at first. Didn't want to know." Sarah's breath caught. "So Danner kidnapped them?" Owen nodded. "And you buried the bodies?" Another nod. "For him?" "No," Owen said with sudden sharpness. "Never for him." He leaned forward. "I buried them because nobody else would. Because they deserved someone to put them in the ground proper." Sarah stared, unable to breathe. "And the Harper boys?" she asked. For the first time, Owen's eyes filled with something, grief or regret, or something deeper. "That's what you came for," he whispered. "Yes." Owen exhaled through his nose. "Raymond was watching them boys months before he took 'em. Helping on the farm, acting friendly. I told Samuel not to let that man stay on his land. But he didn't listen, not until Ruth got scared. He looked down. When they fired him, he didn't go far. Sarah felt cold creep up her spine. He waited, a long breath. And then one day, he took those boys. Sarah leaned in, a voice trembling. What did you do, Owen? Owen looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed much younger, much sharper. I followed him. Her heart slammed against her ribs. He took them west, toward the old quarry. Thought no one saw him. He was wrong. Sarah whispered, Were they alive? Owen swallowed. Yes. She closed her eyes, fighting tears. What happened next? Owen's voice cracked for the first time. I tried to get him back. Raymond pulled a knife. He came at me. It happened fast. Sarah's eyes opened. You killed him. Owen didn't deny it. I buried him out in the holler near the border. Ain't nobody ever found him. Sarah's throat tightened. And the Harper boys? She pushed. Owen's face twisted. They ran, he whispered. Sarah froze. They ran into the woods. I yelled for them to stop. I couldn't find them. Her pulse thundered. Did you keep searching? For weeks, Owen said. Then months. Hell, years. But the woods, they're deep out there. Full of hollows and old wells and ravines most folks don't know. His voice broke. I never found a trace. Not one. Sarah stared at him, her lip trembling. So you don't know what happened? No, he whispered. I don't know if they made it out or if the woods took them. She stepped back, feeling crushed. All this time, she said, you said nothing. Owen's eyes glistened. I was scared. Not of the law. Lord knows I deserve that. But scared that if I told folks, they'd think I'd done it. And scared of living the rest of my life, knowing I failed those boys twice. Silence filled the room. Outside, a wind moved through the pines. Soft, hollow, endless. Sarah finally spoke. You buried 2 boys. You buried Danner. You covered it all up. I tried to stop evil, he whispered, and I made a bigger mess in the process. She exhaled shakily. Are you ready to confess this formally? Owen sighed. I've been waiting 50 years to tell someone. Owen was arrested without resistance. He gave a full written confession. He showed investigators where he buried Danner. Remains were recovered. He identified the hollow where the unknown brothers were found. He detailed Danner's role in the abductions of multiple children across 3 states. But when it came to Evan and Jake Harper, he couldn't give an ending. No bodies, no trace, no closure. The Harper boys remain missing. Their final fate is unknown. But for the first time in nearly 50 years, it's clear they were never taken by family. Never sold, never trafficked, never forgotten. They ran into the woods, terrified, in the confusion of a violent struggle, and vanished. Maybe into the ravine, maybe into the old mine shafts, maybe into territory no one searched deeply enough. Their story, like so many cold cases, remains unfinished. But one truth finally came to light. They weren't abandoned. They weren't thrown away. They weren't alone. A man chased the darkness, trying to save them. And somewhere out there in those Georgia woods, the last footsteps of Evan and Jake Harper still echo against the pines. The case is officially closed with no resolution, but not for lack of truth. Some mysteries end not with answers, but with revelation. And sometimes, the closest thing to justice is finally knowing what really happened in the dark.